Welcome to a special ambassadorial edition of what has become a regular series of Perth US Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ambassador Richard Court, Australia's ambassador to Japan since 2017, who has represented our interests there and led the relationship between Australia and Japan for the last nearly 4 years. For audiences here in Western Australia, of course, Richard needs no introduction. He served as our 26th Premier from 1993 all the way through 2001 for nearly 3 terms, and has been a respected leader of the community and business community more broadly. Awarded a Companion of the Order of Australia for his national contributions, and now taking his talents international and helping us in the Indo-Pacific region with one of our most important relationships, that with Japan. Richard, thank you so much for making the time to join us.
Always good talking with you, Gordon.
Now, you kindly, several occasions in the past when you visited Perth, joined us for what is an ongoing series of off-the-record roundtable ambassadors dialogue discussions in that beautiful Senate room at UWA. Our last meeting, which we held virtually, was really, really fascinating. And we felt as an institution that your insights on this very important relationship would be well served to be shared with a broader audience. And so we appreciate you being willing to do this recorded interview that we can share more broadly, because this relationship really is very important, not just to Australians, but to the region more broadly. Now, I wonder if I might start off with the obvious question, and that is just, can you just give us a brief update on Japan 2020? Obviously, COVID-19 has had some very real economic impacts, which have just manifested themselves in the last week in terms of the numbers, but we've seen for the last 6 months, obviously the health impact, the cancellation of the Olympics. Can you just give us a quick take on Japan 2020?
Sure. Well, look, Gordon, it wasn't the year they planned for, and it wasn't the year Australia planned for. Their plan was to have the Chinese president visit early in the year, quite a historic visit, followed by the Olympics and the Paralympics. Of course, COVID-19's changed all of that. But look, Japan's handled COVID-19 well. In fact, I think exceptionally well. They went through the first wave and they were able to keep the death rate quite low. You know, they were sort of pretty pleased that they were able to keep it under control. Currently, they are going through a second wave. And this time, the second wave, the positive cases are quite a bit higher, but interestingly, the mortality rate is very low. You look at Japan, 126 million people, and they have in total just over 1,000 deaths. The UK, with half that population, has 41,000 deaths. And if you look at it, deaths per million, they are at 8 per million. Australia is 13, and the United States is nearly 500. So overall, they've done a remarkably good job remembering this is a country where people are living in very high density, areas like Greater Tokyo is some 38 million people. So all in all, very impressive. The other interesting thing about their second wave here is that in the first wave, the average hospital stay was 3 weeks. Now it is 1 week. So they're obviously working out better treatments, and overall, it's a pretty good result. What do you put it down to? Many reasons. Good public health system. It's a country that is very disciplined when it comes to wearing masks, etc. They've always respected people's personal spaces. They have what they call respect the 3 C's here: crowded spaces, confined spaces, and close contact. And if you stick by those 3 C's, wear masks, it seems to be achieving the results. Postponing the Olympics, very disappointing, because they put a huge effort into it, and they are so keen for the Olympics to be held next year, mainly for the the sporting people themselves, they've trained so hard for these games, and they are very keen to put on the event.
I have to say that the 3 Cs in Japan are a little bit more relevant to the COVID era than the 3 Cs that are typically listed in the Australia-India relationship of cricket, curry, and Commonwealth. It's kind of hard to apply that to COVID.
Yeah.
Mr. Ambassador, one of the primary tools of foreign policy is summitry. You were instrumental in an earlier summit meeting when then Prime Minister Turnbull had a highly successful visit to Tokyo. These days, in the era of COVID, such summitry is difficult. I understand there was a relatively recent video teleconference or a virtual summit that took place between Prime Minister Abe Shinzo and Prime Minister Morrison, and that among the range of issues that were discussed, responded to COVID, et cetera, was working together to ensure the integrity of supply chains. I wonder if you might give us your takeaway from that virtual summit, some of the key areas in the bilateral relationship that is taking place now between Australia and Japan.
Well, the important thing is the bilateral relationship is incredibly strong. But the reality is we're going to need many strong bilateral relationships in the region if we are to bring about the sort of balance that we require. Look, it's one thing to have a virtual meeting, but I think it is far more effective if you can have a face-to-face meeting. And Prime Minister Morrison was very keen, is very keen for that to occur as soon as possible. But Gordon, I had the privilege of being in the room with Prime Minister Abe for that meeting. The personal rapport between our two Prime Ministers is excellent. And the meeting was scheduled for 1 hour. It went for nearly double that time. And they were able to cover a wide range of issues. Look, basically, we're on the same page with all of the important issues. So the bilateral relationship, very strong, but at the same time, both countries agree that we have to use more effectively some of the international organisations. We've got to work through some of these multilateral forums, and there's many of them, as you know. There's the East Asia Summit, there's G20, there's the World Health Organization, there's United Nations, OECD, many international financial institutions. And we've got to be able to utilise those international agencies more effectively. So all in all, a very successful meeting, very good relationship between the two leaders. And that is very important, particularly when we are in the middle of a pandemic of this nature.
One of the interesting developments in the Australia-Japan relationship is the evolution of it just from a bilateral relationship into a partnership. And if you look at the cooperation between Japan and Australia several years ago in remarkably resuscitating the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the form of the Cooperative and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You look at Australia-Japan cooperation on infrastructure within Southeast Asia. You look at Australia-Japan working together in this relationship with India. It really seems to be that whether it's globally or regionally, Japan is one of Australia's most important partners, not just a bilateral relationship to be had. Where do you see our cooperation regionally between Australia and Japan?
Look, you're quite correct. In relation to trade negotiations, when I first came here nearly 4 years ago, of course, TPP, the United States were pulling out, and people just presumed that that was the end of that. But to the credit of both Australia and Japan, they took a leadership role in negotiating a revised agreement, the CPTPP. And that agreement now is one that many other countries want to join. And there's quite a list of countries that would now like to be a part of what is a very high level standard of trade negotiation. We've also been working closely together with the RCEP negotiations. And I think they are two good examples of Australia and Japan taking leadership roles in the Indo-Pacific region. I guess the issue that comes up all the time, Gordon, is the tension currently between the United States and China, and how does countries like Japan and Australia, how do we handle that sort of situation? The US has pushed back very hard in relation to China and its role in world trade. But we need to sort of face a bit of reality here because China itself has become quite an economic success story. Australia, it's our largest trading partner. It's also a very important trading partner for Japan. So we need to work out how we can, in a constructive way, how we can keep that relationship on an even keel. And, we talk about opening up markets, negotiating trade agreements. China's growth has been very much on the back of getting access to global markets. And China itself will not want to be isolated from markets. And as a country like China becomes more powerful, both politically and economically, it also needs to accept more responsibility. So it is a changing power structure in the region. It is so important that like-minded countries work together in a collaborative way. And I believe that Australia and Japan are setting a very good example in that regard.
You referenced both Japan and Australia being like-minded countries, and earlier on in talking about the bilateral relationship, you noted how simpatico we are. When we express our national interests domestically here in Australia, we often refer to what we call the rules-based order, the liberal international system upon which so much of our prosperity and our security has depended. Is that an area where Japan is simpatico with us as well? Do they think of the rules-based order in the same way that we do?
Very much so. When you talk to Japan, how is it addressing the changing power structure in the region? Their simple position is that as a country becomes more powerful, it needs to accept more responsibility, and it needs to be prepared to operate under rules that have been developed over time and have been proven to be effective. And in other words, you've got to comply with international law, and there's so many issues where powerful countries need to set a positive example. Are we on the same page with Japan? Very much so. If you look at international organisations, both Japan and Australia, we would like to be having more effective roles in some of those organisations. And I think that's going to take a longer term perspective. As you know only too well, Gordon, you've got to take a 5 to 10 year sort of look at how changes will take place in many of those international organisations that are responsible for setting and implementing a lot of the rules.
In your initial response, you focus rightly on the health and the public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has naturally been the primary focus in Japan, throughout the region, here in Australia as well. But there's also a very important secondary impact, and that is the economic impact of the pandemic. Australia has had an unprecedented 30-year period of economic growth, which has been broken for the first time by the pandemic. And the reports that came out this week suggest that the economic impact in Japan has been, if anything, more severe. That really kind of puts some pressure on both of our governments to figure out ways that we might work together post-COVID-19 towards an economic recovery. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Australia and Japan are and are likely in the future to kind of work together on that front?
Yes, look, the post-COVID world is one that we really need to prepare for. You're quite right, it's severely damaged everyone's economies. Japan announced its figures recently, and that sort of second quarter, it had quite a downturn, but relatively compared to many other countries, it's reasonably good. But unfortunately, currently there's a bit of an uplift taking place. But when you shut down the borders, as most countries or many countries have done, it has a severe effect on a lot of the service industries. So, Gordon, perhaps I can look at this post-COVID world perhaps from a Japanese perspective, because Japan is a global player. Japan is a global investor. And if you are a Japanese financial institution, you're more than likely to be lending across many different countries. If you are a Japanese company, if you are a Toyota, Hitachi, Panasonic, or whatever, you are going to be operating in many different countries. And so from a Japanese perspective, they really follow the international scene very closely. And they're looking at how all the different countries will be coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic. And they, from a geostrategic point of view, sure, they are watching the power centers move, and they fully understand that the tensions between the US and China, they are also very concerned about some countries might take advantage of their corporations being in a weakened position, and so all of those issues have to be addressed pretty closely. But in relation to the supply chains, COVID-19 has been a wake-up call. Many countries, including Australia, we got caught out with some of our basic, supplies of masks and other health-related matters. There's been some big lessons learned. Japan has always had what they call a China plus one strategy. But as a result of COVID-19, they will diversify more. They will be diversifying across to Southeast Asian countries, but interestingly also to Australia. They like investing in Australia, and so there will be opportunities for us. But Japan will not decouple from China. You've got to be realistic. They do a lot of two-way trade with China, but you will see them diversify some of their supply chains. Also, the Japanese government and the corporations, they're looking internationally. They're seeing that capitalism is coming under a bit of attack. It's being questioned. People are wanting to change. They're seeing too much inequality in different countries, and that inequality is leading to some anti-globalization sort of attacks and populist leaders coming to the fore. So they're keeping a close eye on how can they improve equality, and COVID-19 unfortunately could well create more inequality. So these are the types of issues that Japan knows it needs to address. But also, interestingly, Gordon, there's a little bit of a mini revolution taking place inside Japan from a lifestyle perspective. You know only too well, you've got the image of the salaryman coming to work in his suit, carrying his briefcase, walking through Shinagawa Station with about tens of thousands of other people, going to work in the office, staying at his desk, staying at work until the boss leaves, which could be 7, 8 o'clock at night, and then going down to the station to grab a cheap meal and a beer under the station before commuting an hour and a half home. When he gets home, children are asleep, not great for family life. Well, this year, with teleworking, they've experienced an alternative. And what we're seeing is many of the office workers and many of the corporations now believe that there will be quite a significant change in lifestyles here. They will be able to do more teleworking. People will perhaps move a bit further out of Tokyo, the bigger cities, to have more space, semi-rural type areas. And so the property developers are now saying, well, look, what trends is this going to create? So you would be surprised, Gordon, if you walk through the centre of Tokyo today, as I did this morning, there's just not the numbers of people in the offices. And when you talk to the corporations, they say they are all operating very productively and very effectively. So it's opening up an alternative. The other area with COVID-19, it's been a bit of a wake-up call for both governments and the corporate world. We think of Japan being very sophisticated when it comes to utilising new technologies, and many companies are, but from a digitisation point of view, some areas are still quite archaic. I mean, the daily reporting of COVID-19 up until a few weeks ago, every individual case was faxed through to a central collection point. And then they would look at a sheet, one single sheet of paper, and that would have all the information about that case. They're now just starting to digitize that process. When the Japanese government wanted to give everyone a 100,000 yen financial boost, they had difficulty in working out how to actually achieve that. So that'll be the second quiet revolution. You are starting to see more digitization occurring across both government and the corporate world here. But the most critical issue that Japan is facing, and it's our most critical issue, is how do you revitalize that small and medium-sized companies that are the major employers of people? The employment process in Japan is they tend to they tend to hang on to their workforce and support the workforce, and so you don't see high unemployment numbers. And like Australia, they're providing financial support packages for corporations, but they are still very worried about perhaps the unreported, the underutilisation of the workforce. So like Australia, there's a big drive to try and revitalise that small and medium-sized companies. The industry that's been hurt the most here is the tourism-related industries, because tourism's effectively stopped, very similar to what is happening in Australia. So what you are going to see the government's focus on is providing liquidity for small businesses, and they do not want to see a whole lot of insolvency taking place with these small and medium-sized businesses. And one thing I learnt when I was a commerce student at UWA, Gordon, was businesses go broke when they run out of cash, not when they run out of assets. And so they are very keen to try and keep that liquidity in the small and medium-sized businesses. And that's a very similar challenge to what we are facing in Australia.
I am indeed familiar with the particular Japanese fixation on facsimiles, and the juxtaposition between faxes and telework is remarkable. So I think because Japan does tend to lead the way for much of the region, that's going to be a very interesting development for us to continue to watch. I realize your time is precious, but I wonder if I might kind of wrap up with one kind of larger perspective question. And that is, in addition to all the events of 2020, which have got our attentions now, it's also a very important historical year in many other respects. We've just marked the 75th anniversary of the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In a few weeks, or a few days rather, we're going to mark the end of World War II. And that means it's been 75 years since there's been a tremendous transformation in the Australia-Japan relationship. And obviously, as a former premier that was deeply involved in Japanese investment here in this state, given your own family's long history in that too, I don't really need to tell you about how important and how transformative the Japan-Australia relationship was for this state, in particular WA. But I wonder if you might look a little bit longer term and focus on those sectors, those industries, those trends where you think the future of Japan-Australia relations lie based on your current position there in Tokyo.
Well, first of all, Gordon, we have come a long way. I attended the memorial services in Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75 years ago. Those cities were bombed, and my own father was fighting the Japanese in Papua New Guinea and Bougainville in the Second World War. And in a relatively short period of time, we've been able to go through that process of forgiveness, reconciliation, and building on commercial links and building up to this incredible trust and respect that we have today. Where we are today is that Australia today really has street cred in the Indo-Pacific region. The Japanese obviously look to the United States as the main country that they're dealing with. The United States is providing its defence shield. But the second country they look to now is Australia. And so we are taking a stronger leadership role in what is happening across our region, our part of the world, this Indo-Pacific. We want it to be open, prosperous, stable, and we are accepting our responsibility in doing more. We have a very credible defence capability, but more important than that, we are starting to build up a lot of, diplomatic strengths, certainly in the Pacific area and increasingly across those Southeast Asian countries. When you look to the future, we have seen Prime Minister Abe, for example, build a very close relationship with Prime Minister Modi in India. Similarly, Prime Minister Morrison is building a close relationship with Prime Minister Modi in India. We are building a closer relationship with countries like Vietnam. And quite frankly, Gordon, I think the Australian government is doing a great job in strengthening those links across the region, but the corporate world also needs to be doing more. It needs to realise there are some wonderful opportunities for us to develop our strengths across many of these countries. So looking to the future, we will be an important part of providing a balance in the region, like-minded countries, democracies, working together to open up the trade so that we can have more prosperity in each of our countries. And I think it's going to be a very properly handled, I think it's going to be a very prosperous future. We happen to be in a part of the world that's got so many growth opportunities, and I see nothing but coming out of this post-COVID world, get the health issues sorted out and working with like-minded countries, positive future.
Ambassador Court, you may recall that before my decision to move to Australia 7 years ago, I spent the last 15 years in Washington, D.C. as head of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation, which was named after the United States' longest-serving Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield, who also was the United States' longest-serving ambassador to Japan. He served nearly 12 years as ambassador to Japan. I realize that your good wife probably wants to come home from Perth. I realize that the community here in Western Australia probably wants you home. But given the remarkable job you've done for the last 4 years, I figure 4 years down, 8 years to go. Thank you so much for the tremendous work that you're doing in Tokyo and for sharing your insights with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Gordon. And I always enjoy being involved with the Perth US Asia Centre. I always think you've got the best job in Australia.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.